There's something about wide, open ranch land that feels eternal. Grass rolling in every direction, fence posts leaning slightly from decades of wind, and cattle wandering lazily without a care for boundaries drawn on paper. For years, my family's land had been that place of calm permanence. 1,000 acres tucked away at the edge of town, where time moved slower and the world's problems seemed to exist somewhere far away. But permanence is an illusion, and when a homeowners association sets its sights on something, they will twist, push, and grab until they've carved out exactly what they want. The HOA in question wasn't even near my property, at least not at first glance. Their development sat a few miles away, a glittering new suburban subdivision with cookie-cutter homes, manicured lawns, and a board of directors who acted like they owned the county itself. The kind of place where residents couldn't even paint their doors the wrong shade of beige without a fine. Their neighborhood was young, their population growing, and with growth came a problem more dangerous than an angry board member: a shortage of water. My ranch bordered a spring-fed creek that had been flowing since before my great-grandfather first claimed the land. That creek didn't just water cattle, it recharged a small aquifer under the ground. Generations of ranchers had dug wells into it, and the water was always clean, always cold, always steady. And someone on that HOA board figured out that our water was the key to their endless expansion. I didn't learn about their plans until it was already too late. It started innocently enough. Some surveyors out on the county road, jotting down notes, setting up little orange flags. They weren't on my property yet, so I thought nothing of it. A few weeks later, the machinery arrived. Backhoes, trenchers, flatbeds hauling sections of gleaming pipe. Then one morning, I saddled up and rode to the far end of the ranch to check on fence lines. That's when I saw it. A raw trench cut straight across my north pasture. Dirt piled high on either side, and men in hard hats lowering in steel pipe as if they had every right to be there. The pipeline wasn't just near my ranch, it was running straight through it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't just trespass. It was theft. A theft of land, a theft of water, a theft of the peace I had lived with my whole life. The HOA had filed paperwork with the county, claiming they had an easement through my property. According to their so-called documentation, some distant branch of my family had agreed to it decades ago. But when I dug through the county clerk's office, I found the truth. The easement had been filed under an entirely different parcel number. They weren't just mistaken, they were lying. And yet, with the HOA's dig pockets and slick attorneys, they'd pushed it through without me even being notified. By the time I tried to fight it, the trench was already halfway across my ranch. The board called it a necessary infrastructure project. The county called it progress, and I called it what it was: an invasion. Over the following weeks, the work continued like clockwork. Each morning, the machines growled across the fields, and each evening, the trench stretched farther, scarred deeper. The cattle grew restless, spooked by the noise. I started keeping them penned away from that side of the property, but the damage was done. Trash torn up, topsoil stripped, fences cut and left dangling. When the line was finished, they buried it without fanfare. One day, the dirt piles were gone, the machinery hauled away, the ground smoothed flat as if nothing had ever happened. Except there was something. Underneath my ranch now lay a lifeline that didn't belong to me, carrying water that wasn't meant for them, feeding a subdivision that had no respect for the land it stole from. The HOA didn't stop there. They built a pump station just beyond my north fence, shiny and new, humming with electricity. From there, their pipes carried water back toward their development, hidden under cul-de-sacs and sidewalks, feeding garden sprinklers and power-washed driveways. I could have sued. In fact, I did try. But every time I went to court, their lawyers were waiting, armed with binders of technical jargon and selectively chosen documents. The county commissioners, many of whom had investments tied up in that new development, turned their eyes away. Every legal move I made, they countered with 3 more. Every attempt at justice sank into the same mud that now covered their pipeline. So I sat on the porch, night after night, staring across my land and listening to the faint hum of that pump station. I thought about my grandfather, who'd built his life here, and about my father, who'd bled into this soil. I thought about how a group of suburban bullies had taken a piece of my family's heritage without so much as a thank you. And that's when I realized something. If the HOA could play dirty, so could I. I began studying the maps, tracing creeks and springs, following every trickle back to its source. That's when I found it, the real beginning. A few miles upstream, tucked away on a forgotten hillside, lay the spring that fed the creek. It was small, hidden, but it was everything. The HOA had stolen the pipeline, but the source? That was still free. And land rights, unlike backroom easements, could be bought. It took months of quiet negotiations, working through a family that didn't realize the value of what they had. They'd owned the spring for generations, but didn't use it for more than a few acres of pasture. To them, it was just another patch of land. To me, it was power. When the deal finally went through, I signed the papers with a steady hand and walked away knowing that everything had just shifted. The HOA thought they had won. They thought the pipeline guaranteed their future. But what they didn't understand, what they could never understand, is that water is not controlled by pipe. Water is controlled by the source. And now, the source belonged to me.
Owning land is one thing. Owning water is another. In the West, people have fought wars over less. Generations of families, developers, and corporations have risen and fallen because they underestimated the value of water. Now, in my hands, lay the deed to the spring that fed not only my ranch, but also the very pipeline the HOA had shoved through my property. I didn't announce my purchase. I didn't send a letter to the HOA. I didn't stand on the fence line shouting about my victory. No, I stayed silent. Because power, real power, doesn't need to be paraded. It only needs to be held until the right moment. The first few weeks after the sale, nothing changed on the surface. The creek still flowed, cattle still drank, and the HOA's pipeline still hummed as it drew water for their development. Neighbors gossiped about new families moving into the subdivision, about the HOA enforcing fines on someone who dared grow wildflowers instead of turf grass. They didn't know that beneath their carefully trimmed hedges and polished sidewalks, every drop of water they relied on was passing through land I now controlled. I spent that time preparing, quietly, methodically. First, I walked the land I had purchased. The spring bubbled up from a cleft in the hillside, shaded by a thicket of scrub oak and juniper. It wasn't much to look at, just a pool of clear water spilling into a trickle of creek. But it was steady, ancient, and alive. I tested its flow rates, checked the mineral content, even spoke to a hydrologist who confirmed what I already suspected. The spring was the artery of the aquifer, the beating heart of the system. Control it, and I controlled everything downstream. Second, I started tracing the HOA's usage. I drove past their pump station on quiet evenings, noting when the machinery kicked on and when it slowed. I watched sprinkler systems in their subdivision run in perfect synchronization, whole streets glistening in artificial rain. I counted garden hoses stretched across driveways, pools refilling under the hot sun, cars being power washed as though water were endless. And all the while, I thought about the arrogance of it. The board members probably never even considered where the water came from. To them, it was just another utility, something they were entitled to because they could afford it. They didn't realize that the land itself has limits, and that their limitless supply had been stolen under my boots. I could have cut them off immediately. One valve, one lock, and their pumps would run dry overnight. But that wasn't the plan. No. I wanted them to feel the ground shift slowly, to sense the unease building, to realize too late that they had made a mistake crossing me. So I waited. The HOA continued expanding. New houses went up at the far end of their subdivision, cookie-cutter boxes sprouting like weeds. The board bragged in newsletters about their sustainable growth, patting themselves on the back for what they called a model community. Meanwhile, they never mentioned the pipeline that trespassed across my ranch, never admitted the quiet theft they had engineered to make their dream possible. But the cracks were already forming. That summer was dry, one of the driest on record. Reservoirs in the county dropped, wells in surrounding farms began to sputter. Everyone knew a drought was coming, but the HOA acted as if it couldn't touch them. Their lawns stayed green, their pools sparkled, their water bills remained unchanged. And that smugness became the seed of their downfall. Because when everyone else suffers, people start asking questions. Why does one neighborhood thrive while others struggle? Why do ranchers haul in tanks of water while a subdivision 2 miles away wastes it on landscaping? The county began to take notice. Reports surfaced in local papers. Tensions grew. And all the while, I kept my mouth shut, letting suspicion swirl around them. Then came my first move. Not a cutoff. Not yet. Just a reduction. With a small adjustment upstream, I slowed the flow feeding into their line. Barely noticeable at first. A few gallons per minute shaved off the supply. The HOA didn't notice right away, but residents did. Sprinklers that once sprayed strong began to sputter. Showers lost pressure in the morning rush. By the end of the week, their swimming pools took longer to refill. Complaints flooded into their board meetings. Homeowners demanded answers. The HOA responded with the usual arrogance, insisting the county must have restricted the system or that routine maintenance explained the issue. They promised everything was fine. But I knew better. I sat on my porch at dusk, watching the horizon glow with the lights of that subdivision, and I smiled. Because, for the first time since they cut into my land, I wasn't the one on defense. They were. And they didn't even know who was pulling the strings. Another week passed. I tightened the valve again. More complaints, more frustration. The HOA doubled down, telling residents to conserve water as a temporary measure. Temporary. They had no idea the supply was no longer theirs to command. Then, the ultimate irony. A letter arrived in my mailbox. A notice from the HOA itself, addressed to me, even though I wasn't a member of their ridiculous community. The letter demanded that I reduce my livestock usage because, according to them, overuse of agricultural water was affecting their neighborhood. I held the letter in my hands and laughed out loud. They were accusing me, on my own ranch, on land my family had held for generations, of taking water that didn't even belong to them. They didn't know the truth. They didn't realize the only reason they had any water at all was because I allowed it. That was the moment I decided. No more half measures. No more warnings. If they wanted to play this game, then I would show them what it meant to pick a fight with someone who actually understood the land. The source was mine. The flow was mine. And soon, they would learn what life looked like when the tap ran dry.
The thing about control is this. Most people don't notice it until it's gone. For months, the HOA had strutted around with the confidence of kings, certain their subdivision was untouchable. They thought the pipeline was their victory, their guarantee of security. But kings are only as strong as the water in their wells, and in the summer of the drought, the wells ran empty. It started small, as all disasters do. A homeowner on Cedar Hollow Lane reported that their shower lost pressure halfway through the morning. Another complained about sprinklers refusing to pop up in the yard, sputtering in dry soil. By the weekend, entire streets were calling in problems. Faucets hissed with air. Washing machines wouldn't fill. Pools sat half empty, sun-cracked and dull. The HOA board panicked behind closed doors. They told residents the shortages were temporary, But now those same residents were marching into meetings demanding answers. And answers were hard to come by when their entire water lifeline was throttled by someone they didn't even realize existed. Meanwhile, my ranch thrived. My cattle watered at steady troughs, my pastures stayed green, and the creek continued flowing past my boots. Every drop they lost was a reminder that I had made the right move when I bought the spring. The land doesn't lie, it only rewards those who respect it. The HOA tried to bluff. They sent out newsletters assuring residents that the system was undergoing adjustments. They told families to restrict usage to critical needs only, but offered no timeline for restoration. That was their fatal mistake. Because when people pay thousands in HOA dues and mortgages, they don't tolerate excuses. It wasn't long before rumors started circulating. Some said the county had cut them off. Others claimed nearby farms had sabotaged the system. A few even suggested that the water table itself had collapsed, leaving nothing underground. Each theory stoked fear, and fear bred anger. Anger pointed in every direction, but mostly it pointed back at the HOA board. I drove past their subdivision one evening, just to see the fallout with my own eyes. Lawns were browning, grass shriveling into brittle straw. Homeowners dragged hoses across driveways, only to discover nothing came out. Children ran through sprinklers that never sprayed. And at the edge of the neighborhood, the pump station sat silent, the hum gone, the machinery lifeless. It was eerie, like watching a city crumble in slow motion. Back at the ranch, I kept to my routine, mending fences, feeding cattle, walking the line of the creek where it curled through willows. Each step reminded me of the balance of power. They had built their community on borrowed water, and now they were paying the price. But the HOA wasn't ready to admit defeat. No, they were too proud for that. They launched investigations, hired engineers, and paid consultants to analyze the system. All the money in the world couldn't fix the simple truth that without my spring, their pipeline was nothing but an empty tube buried under dirt. One morning, I found a white SUV parked near the fence at the north end of my property. Two men in hard hats stood by the pump station, gesturing angrily at the silent machinery. They glanced toward my land, but didn't cross the line. They knew better, at least for now. Still, I could feel the storm building. The HOA wasn't going to let this go quietly. They had investors, they had pride, they had an entire community looking to them for answers. Sooner or later, they were going to realize where the problem began. And when they did, I needed to be ready. That evening, I pulled the letter they had sent me, the one accusing me of overusing water, out of the drawer. I read it again, letting the words sink in. The audacity, the arrogance. They had no idea that I was the one holding the tap closed. But here's the truth. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted respect. For years, people like the HOA had looked at ranchers like me as relics, stubborn holdouts standing in the way of progress. They didn't care about the soil, the water, or the generations who had worked this land. They only cared about convenience, about profit, about control. So this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about making a point. About showing them that you can't steamroll over people and expect to walk away unscathed. The first cracks appeared in the HOA board itself. Internal arguments spilled out of their closed meetings. Some directors wanted to sue the county. Others wanted to impose emergency water restrictions on residents. A few quietly suggested raising HOA dues to truck in water. But the loudest voices insisted on denial, clinging to the illusion that the problem would solve itself. Residents weren't fooled. They started forming small groups, meeting in garages, sharing theories, whispering about incompetence and corruption. What had been a polished, orderly neighborhood was now unraveling into chaos. And still, the water didn't come back. On the ranch, I made one final adjustment upstream. The creek still flowed enough for my needs, but the line into their pipeline dried completely. By the next morning, the subdivision was bone dry. Toilets wouldn't flush, dishes piled in sinks, tempers boiled over. That's when the HOA board made their biggest mistake yet.
Instead of admitting the truth, they doubled down. They issued threats to residents who voiced complaints. They fined families for letting lawns brown, insisting it was a violation of community standards, even though the board knew the water was gone. Imagine fining someone for not watering their grass when you've cut off their supply. That was the moment residents turned on them. I watched from a distance, but I didn't have to get close to hear the roar. The HOA had built their empire on false promises, and now it was collapsing from within. Families were calling lawyers. Angry crowds showed up at board meetings. Rumors spread about mismanagement, embezzlement, even conspiracy. But none of them knew the truth. None of them realized the real reason their facets had run dry. Not yet. The board would find out soon enough. They had crossed me once, and now they were about to learn what happens when you steal from a man who understands the land better than they ever will. The question wasn't if they'd come knocking at my door. It was when. And I was ready.
Control always draws attention. For weeks, I had held the valve on their lifeline, watching their community crumble while mine thrived. At first, they stumbled in confusion, convinced the county or bad luck was to blame. But confusion can only last so long. Eventually, suspicion sharpens into anger, and anger demands a target. The target was me. It began subtly. A pair of SUVs parked on the county road, just beyond my fence line. Men inside, sunglasses on, watching the land. They didn't come onto the property, not yet, but their message was clear. They were circling, waiting, looking for weakness. A few days later, county officials appeared. Clipboards in hand, they trudged up to the north pasture, inspecting the pump station. They didn't cross the fence either, but they shouted questions I had no intention of answering. I leaned against a fence post and watched them sweat in the sun until they finally gave up and left. And then, one evening, they came directly. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel before I saw them. 2 black SUVs rolled up the long drive to my ranch house, dust trailing in their wake. They parked side by side, blocking the exit as though I might try to run, which was laughable. This was my land. I had nowhere to run. The doors opened, and out stepped 3 men in pressed suits, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of weathered barns and open pastures. They weren't ranchers. They weren't county officials. They were HOA board members, the kind of men who spent more time in meetings about mailbox paint colors than they did touching dirt. Their shoes sank slightly in the gravel as they approached, each step carrying an air of authority they thought would intimidate me. It didn't. I didn't greet them. I didn't shake hands. I just stood on the porch, arms crossed, letting them come closer until they stopped at the bottom of the steps. They looked at me like I was a problem to be solved, a roadblock in their carefully planned empire. And then they spoke their truth. Of course, I won't repeat their exact words. This is narration, not dialogue. But the essence was simple. They knew. They had traced the problem upstream, hired consultants, and pieced together the puzzle. The source of their water shortage was no mystery anymore. The spring I now owned had been the heart of their system, and I had closed it off. They demanded I restore the flow. They cited community necessity, public good, even legal obligation. They threw words around like confetti, convinced that paperwork and threats would bend me to their will. But what they didn't understand was that this wasn't about law anymore. This was about leverage. And all the leverage was mine. I didn't respond. Silence is a weapon, sharper than any retort. They filled the quiet with bluster, sweating under the weight of their own desperation. I let them speak until their words ran dry, the same way their faucets had. Finally, when they realized they wouldn't get what they came for, their tone shifted.
The arrogance softened into something else: fear. Because behind their polished veneers and expensive suits, they were just men staring down the collapse of their kingdom. And I was the one holding the rope. They left without resolution, but the tension lingered. I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA didn't send board members in person unless the situation was dire. If they couldn't intimidate me into compliance, they'd escalate. That's how people like them operated, always pressing harder, always clawing for control. And escalate they did. The next week brought a storm of letters, thick envelopes stuffed with legal jargon, accusing me of withholding essential resources and threatening lawsuits. County inspectors appeared at my gate demanding entry for environmental evaluations. Developers called my phone at all hours offering to buy the spring outright for sums that might tempt a weaker Madden. But money wasn't the point. Control was. And control wasn't for sale. Meanwhile, their subdivision was spiraling out of control. Residents had gone from frustration to outright rebellion. Meetings devolved into shouting matches. Families staged protests outside the HOA office. News outlets caught wind of the crisis, splashing headlines about the neighborhood without water across local papers. And me? I stayed quiet. Every article that ran, every whisper of gossip, every angry outburst from their residents, all of it added fuel to the fire. The board grew more desperate by the day, yet the more they clawed, the tighter my grip became. Then came the county hearing. The HOA had petitioned the commissioners to force me to reopen the spring, arguing that it was critical infrastructure for community survival. They claimed I had no right to restrict it. They painted me as a selfish rancher, hoarding resources while families suffered. I attended that hearing. I sat quietly in the back as their lawyers spewed lies. And when my turn came, I simply held up the deed. The legal, indisputable proof that the spring was mine, purchased fair and square, not leased, not shared, owned. The room went silent. Because here's the thing. Laws can bend, money can sway, but ownership? Ownership is absolute. And no matter how many lawyers they hired, no matter how many officials they bribed, they couldn't erase the fact that I held the title. The commissioners squirmed in their seats. They wanted to side with the HOA, but the law tied their hands. All they could do was mumble about further review and adjourn the meeting without action. The HOA board left that hearing red-faced and furious. For the first time, they had run into a wall they couldn't bulldoze. And that wall was me. But I knew they weren't finished. People like them never admit defeat. They would keep pushing, keep scheming, keep trying to claw back what they thought was theirs. And I was prepared. Because the more they fought, the deeper they dug their own grave. And soon, the entire community, the very residents they claimed to represent, would realize the truth. The HOA wasn't their savior. The HOA was their downfall.
The first sign of retaliation came not with words, but with paper. Thick, glossy envelopes stamped with the HOA's insignia began showing up in my mailbox. Inside were citations, pages of invented violations accusing me of everything from unauthorized land use to improper livestock management. They fined me for fence lines, for cattle grazing, even for the color of paint on my barn. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so desperate. Their subdivision sat miles away, yet they were trying to enforce rules as though my ranch fell under their jurisdiction. It didn't. My land was outside their development, beyond their authority. But that didn't stop him from trying. They thought intimidation through paperwork would wear me down. They thought endless legal harassment would make me cave. What they didn't realize was that ranchers face worse every single day. Storms that destroy crops, droughts that parch the earth, predators that stalk livestock. Compared to that,
A stack of HOA letters was nothing more than kindling for the fire pit. So I burned them, one by one. When paper failed, they escalated. It started with strangers on my property, men in reflective vests claiming to be inspectors. They crept along my fence line, snapping photos of the spring, measuring water flow with little handheld devices. I confronted them once, and they bolted back to their trucks without a word. Their trespass only confirmed what I already knew. The HOA was growing desperate. Then came the vandalism. Fences cut in the night, cattle let loose into the road, irrigation lines slashed. I'd find tire tracks where no one had any business driving, boot prints near the spring that weren't mine. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't professional, it was retaliation, plain and ugly. But every act of sabotage only hardened my resolve, because with each attack, the HOA revealed itself for what it was, a bully, stripped of polish, lashing out when it realized it had no power left. Meanwhile, their subdivision was collapsing under the weight of its own failure. Residents were furious. Without water, lawns turned to dust, pools cracked, and daily life became a struggle. Families hauled in bottled water just to cook and bathe. Tensions boiled over at HOA meetings, where once complacent homeowners now shouted in the faces of board members who had promised them security. The local news swarmed the story. Cameras rolled as residents carried buckets from tanker trucks parked on the street. Headlines blasted the crisis. Subdivision left dry. HOA under fire. Reporters pressed board members for answers, but all they gave were hollow statements about temporary setbacks and ongoing negotiations. What negotiations? They had none. The truth was simple. I held the source, and without my say, their pipeline was nothing but buried scrap. And then, one morning, I found something new in my mailbox. Not a citation, not a threat. A letter from one of their residents. It was written in shaky handwriting, the words almost pleading. They explained how their family had been blindsided, told by the HOA that water was guaranteed, only to find themselves living in a desert of broken promises. They asked if I, the rancher, could help. They weren't demanding, they weren't entitled, they were desperate. Reading that letter was like striking a match in a room already soaked with kerosene. Because for the first time, I saw the divide clearly. The residents weren't my enemy. They had been lied to, manipulated, dragged into the mess by a board that cared more about control than community. The HOA wanted me to look like the villain. But in truth, the residents were starting to realize who had really failed them. I didn't respond to the letter, not directly, but it planted an idea. If the HOA thought they could turn residents against me, maybe it was time to flip the script. Maybe it was time to show the people who actually held their fate and who had been fighting for their land long before the subdivision even existed. Meanwhile, the HOA board doubled down. They filed for an emergency injunction, demanding the county force me to restore the water flow. They argued that my ownership of the spring was irrelevant, that community necessity outweighed individual rights. But the county wasn't blind. They'd seen the deed. They knew the law was on my side. And though the commissioners dragged their feet, though they muttered about further studies and long-term solutions, they couldn't hand the HOA what it wanted. That didn't stop them from trying another angle, smear campaigns. Suddenly, articles appeared in local papers painting me as a selfish rancher, hoarding water while families suffered. Anonymous posts flooded social media, accusing me of cruelty, greed, even sabotage. They painted my ranch as the obstacle to progress, a relic of the past, refusing to step aside for the future. But the problem with lies is they unravel. And as residents compared stories, as reporters dug deeper, the narrative flipped. The truth about the pipeline came to light. The illegal easement, the bulldozers cutting through my land without permission, the backroom deals that had built their infrastructure on stolen ground. Suddenly, I wasn't the villain anymore. The HOA was. And the residents, once loyal to their board, began turning their anger in the right direction. Protests moved from county buildings to the HOA office itself. Handwritten signs demanded accountability. Homeowners threatened to withhold dues. At one heated meeting, a group even proposed dissolving the HOA entirely. The board was cracking. Their polished facade was crumbling. And I knew it was only a matter of time before the whole rotten structure collapsed. But I also knew something else. Desperate people make dangerous moves. The HOA wasn't going to go quietly. They had money, they had pride, and they were backed into a corner. The next move they made wouldn't be letters or inspections. No, the next move would be something bigger. And when it came, I'd be ready. Because while they were fighting to preserve their illusion of control, I was fighting for something far older, far stronger. The land itself. And the land doesn't forget who respects it and who tries to steal from it.
Desperation is a dangerous fuel. By the time the HOA board realized their subdivision was collapsing, they'd burned through every polite option. Letters, lawyers, threats, smear campaigns, none of it had worked. Residents were rebelling. The county was wavering. And I still held the one thing they needed most. So they made their boldest move yet. It started before dawn. I woke to the sound of engines rumbling on the county road. Trucks, flatbeds, utility rigs, even rented equipment rolled toward the north end of my property. I saddled up and rode out, the cold morning air cutting sharp against my face, and when I reached the ridge overlooking the spring, I saw them. Men in reflective vests, contractors paid by the HOA unloading gear at the fence line. Pumps, pipes, generators. They weren't coming for negotiations anymore. They were coming to take the spring by force. They thought they could bypass me, run new lines, drill into the hillside, seize the source under the banner of community necessity. It didn't matter that I owned the land. It didn't matter that I had the deed in my pocket. To them, possession meant power, and they intended to claim it physically if they couldn't claim it legally. I watched as they cut the fence, rolling back the wire with practiced hands. Trespassing, plain as day, with the arrogance only money can buy. They carried themselves like they were untouchable, like no one could stop them. But they had forgotten something. This wasn't a cul-de-sac or a boardroom. This was ranch land, my land, and out here, the rules were different. I rode down slow, letting the sound of hooves announce me before I even spoke. The men froze when they saw me, caught in the act, but none of them backed down. Their foreman, hard hat, clipboard, the same smugness I'd seen a dozen times before, gestured to the spring as if it were already his. In his mind, it was a done deal. But he hadn't reckoned with the history flowing beneath his boots. That water had sustained generations before his subdivision even existed. It belonged to the land, not to developers. And now, it belonged to me. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply turned my horse and rode the perimeter of the spring, placing myself squarely between them and the water. My silence was louder than any protest. This was my stand, and they knew it. Tension thickened in the air. A few of the contractors shifted uneasily, clearly realizing they were on the wrong side of the law. But the foreman barked at them to keep working. Pumps were unloaded. Pipes were uncoiled. Generators rattled to life. It was a siege, plain and simple. I called the sheriff, not because I trusted him. He'd always been cozy with county officials who bent toward development, but because trespass was trespass, and I wanted this on record. The dispatcher promised a deputy would be out. Hours passed. No one came. Typical. The HOA had likely pulled strings, called in favors, painted me as the obstructionist. But I wasn't surprised. I'd learned long ago that when it came to land and water, the law often bent toward whoever had the deeper pockets. So I stayed, watching, waiting, guarding the spring. By noon, Residents from the subdivision started arriving. Word had spread about the crisis reaching its breaking point. Families drove out in minivans, parking along the road, gathering at the fence line. Some shouted encouragement at the contractors. Others begged them to stop. A few turned their eyes toward me, curiosity burning. Was I the villain or the man protecting what was rightfully his? The crowd grew restless. Tempers flared. The HOA board finally arrived, stepping out of their SUVs in crisp suits that looked absurd in the dust and heat. They strutted up to the fence, puffed with authority, and gestured toward me as if I was nothing more than a roadblock to be removed. But here's the thing. Optics matter. And standing there, surrounded by machines and hired men, the HOA didn't look like saviors anymore. They looked like invaders. And me? I was just a rancher on horseback, defending the spring my family had tended for generations. Cameras rolled. Reporters shouted questions. The standoff was no longer hidden in paperwork or courtrooms. It was unfolding live under the blazing sun. The HOA board tried to spin it, claiming they were securing resources for families in need, but the words rang hollow against the reality. They were trespassing on private land, cutting fences, seizing what wasn't theirs. Residents saw it, the press saw it, the whole county saw it. And then came the turning point. One of the contractors, tired, sweat-soaked, clearly uncomfortable, dropped his wrench and refused to continue. He said it outright, "This isn't legal." Others followed. Pumps sat idle, pipes half-laid, work stalled. The foreman shouted, threatened, even waved contracts in the air, but it was no use. The men weren't willing to risk their livelihoods or their freedom on such a reckless job. The HOA fumed. They demanded deputies be called to arrest me for obstruction. But when the sheriff finally arrived, hours late, he didn't slap cuffs on me. He stood on the ridge, looked at the cut fence, the trespassing equipment, the angry crowd, and knew exactly what this was. For once, the truth was undeniable. The sheriff ordered the contractors off my land, told the HOA to pack up their trucks, promised that if they set foot across the fence line again, charges would follow. The board members sputtered, red-faced and furious, but they had no choice. Under the watch of cameras and residents alike, they loaded their equipment, muttering threats as they went. Their siege had failed. The spring was safe, for now. But as I sat there on horseback, watching the dust settle, I knew this wasn't the end. People like the HOA don't stop just because they lose one battle. They regroup, they scheme, they find another angle. Yet something had changed that day. For the first time, the residents themselves had seen the truth. They saw who really held the water, who respected the land, and who had been lying to them all along. The HOA wasn't just losing water, they were losing their people. And when an HOA loses the faith of its community, its empire begins to crumble.
The siege of the spring broke something in the HOA that no amount of money or bluster could repair. For weeks, they had hidden behind paperwork, lawyers, and intimidation. But when they marched onto my land and tried to seize the source under the eye of the public, the masks slipped. Everyone saw them for what they really were. The residents of their subdivision weren't blind. They had believed the promises at first, the endless water, the sustainable growth, the idea that their dues were buying security. But now they knew the truth. Their water wasn't theirs at all. It came from a spring they didn't own, funneled through a pipeline built on lies. And when the contractors refused to trespass further, when the sheriff finally drew a line in the dust, the people turned, not toward me, but against the board. It started with whispers, then shouts. Families gathered in garages, in driveways, in cul-de-sacs, talking openly about what the HOA had done. They weren't just angry about the water anymore, they were angry about the betrayal, about the dues wasted, about the arrogance that had led their leaders to wage war against the very land that sustained them. Within days, a petition circulated, residents demanding the removal of the entire board. It spread like wildfire, signatures piling up faster than the HOA could suppress. Meetings turned into riots. Board members who once strutted around handing out fines now cowered behind locked doors, facing crowds of neighbors demanding resignations. I didn't have to lift a finger. The HOA's downfall was entirely their own doing. They had stolen, they had lied, and when the truth came out, their kingdom collapsed under its own weight. Meanwhile, the subdivision's problems worsened. With the spring cut off, their pipeline sat useless. Emergency water trucks became a daily sight, rumbling through the streets to deliver bare minimum rations. Lawns turned to dust, homes lost value, and families who had once prided themselves on pristine appearances now lived in a desert of brown yards and brittle hedges. The irony was rich. They had fought so hard for control, yet in the end they had none. The board tried one last gasp of survival. They filed suit in me in federal court, accusing me of weaponizing the water source. But the case never gained traction. The deed was airtight. Every filing they submitted crumbled against the plain fact that I owned the spring fair and square. And with each legal defeat, their credibility eroded further. Residents who once supported them now openly mocked their efforts. Newspapers ran stories about their arrogance. Even the county commissioners, who had once turned a blind eye, distanced themselves from the wreckage. By the end of summer, the HOA was done. Board members resigned one by one, some slinking out under cover of night, others chased out at public meetings where furious residents shouted them down. Dues went unpaid, rules went unenforced. The subdivision dissolved into what it had always been beneath the polish, just a collection of houses, stripped of the illusion of power. And me? I still had my land, my cattle, my creek, my spring. I watched from the ridge as the subdivision slowly changed. Some families left, tired of living without the promise they had been sold. Others stayed, adapting to reality, digging their own wells or joining together to buy water from outside sources. Without the HOA lording over them, they were free to paint doors any color they liked, to plant wildflowers instead of grass, to finally live without constant fines and threats. In a strange way, my fight had freed them too. But make no mistake, I hadn't fought for them. I had fought for the land, for the generations before me who had tended it, and for the generations after me who would inherit it. I had fought because some things are not for sale, not negotiable, not subject to the whims of suits and boardrooms. Water is life, and life belongs to those who respect it. The pipeline still lay buried beneath my pasture, a useless vein of steel with nothing flowing inside. Sometimes when I ride out across the fields, I think about it. How much destruction it caused, how much arrogance it represented. But I don't tear it out. I leave it there, buried under dirt and grass, a reminder that power built on theft never lasts, a reminder that the land always outlives those who try to steal it from it, a reminder that in the end, the HOA didn't just lose their water, they lost everything. And I gained something they never understood. Not just control, not just revenge, but peace. Because the spring still runs, bubbling up from the hillside as it has for centuries. It feeds my cattle, nourishes my land, and flows into the creek that winds through my ranch. It belongs here, untouched, unspoiled, and free. The HOA thought they could steal it, bottle it, pipe it, and claim it as their own. But the water had other plans. And so did I.